Hey everyone, in this quick tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a knitted Easter chick basket. Before you get started, make sure you have a pair of size US 8 or 5mm knitting needles, some yellow, orange, and black yarn, a darning needle, and a pair of scissors. Gather all your materials and let's dive in. So to start off, I've pulled out a couple feet of yarn, and over here on my left I have the tail that's not attached to my ball. Over here on my right I have the yarn that is, and we're going to start out with a slip knot. So just take your yarns and cross them over each other to form a loop. And over here I have this top one, that's the yarn that's not attached to my ball. So the one on top should be the yarn on the left. And now I'm going to pinch the loop at the join and reach right through the center with my thumb and index finger. Just going through the loop and rotate down to pick up this strand of yarn that is not attached to your ball. And then I'm going to hold onto these two strands as I tug up on that loop to tighten it. And there's your slip knot. Now you're ready to start knitting. So just place that on your needle and give that tail a tug to tighten it. To hold your knitting needle, just rest it over your fingers and then kind of pinch it between your thumb and index finger. So this slip knot is going to act as your first cast on stitch. And now to cast on our second one, in my left hand I'm going to drape this yarn that is not attached to my ball over my fingers. Just resting it like that, and then I'm going to make a thumbs up sign, rotate my thumb down to rest on top of the yarn, and hook under. So I'm just going from here with the thumbs up, down, and under, and then back up. And now with my knitting needle, I'm going to pick up this leg of yarn and go through that loop that I formed with my thumb. So now my thumb and my knitting needle are making an X with the loop of yarn around the X. And now, this part of the cast on is actually going to use the knit stitch. So if you have knit before, this part's going to be no problem. In my right hand, I'm going to pick up the yarn that is attached to my ball, and I'm going to wrap behind the knitting needle. So I'm just going back and over, taking it behind the tip and then flicking it over the top. So now, you can kind of see this loop through the loop formed by my thumb. You should be able to see that yarn that you just wrapped around the needle. And now with your thumb, you can slide that loop over top of the knitting needle, pull your thumb out, and give it a tug to tighten. So now you're just going to continue doing this until you have 38 stitches. Each one of these loops is a stitch, so count. Once you have 38, meet me back here and I'll show you the next step. I've just cast on my final stitch. I only have 20 stitches on my needle, but you should have 38. So right now, this tail of yarn that is connected to my ball is coming out of here from the back of the needle. That's not good. We want to switch this so that we can start knitting. So what I'm going to do is rotate my needle 180 degrees, and I'm going to switch it to my left hand. And now I can pick up my empty needle in my right hand and get ready to knit my first stitch. So just slide your stitches up closer to the tip of your needle to make them easier to reach. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my right needle and go into the loop of that first stitch, just under this first bar of yarn, and right through the center of that loop with my right needle crossing behind. Now with my right hand, I can pick up this tail of yarn, and once again I'm going to wrap behind the tip of that needle and flick over top and pull down so that I can see the yarn through that loop. And then with my left needle, I'm going to pull up so that my right needle is now on top. So I'm just going from here with my left needle on top and my right needle crossing behind it, and they're switching positions so that my right needle is on top and my left needle is crossing behind it. And now I'm going to pull up on my right needle and slide that stitch off of my left one. And there you go. That's your first knit stitch. One more time through the center of that stitch, behind the needle and over top, with my yarn and then pull up on my left needle so that the needles switch positions, and then pull up on my right one to slide that stitch off. And you'll continue doing this until you reach the end of your row. I'm about to knit my last stitch of the row, and now I'm ready to switch needles. So right now, my full needle is in my right hand, and I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees and pick it up in my left. So you can see that this yarn that's connected to my ball is leading out from that stitch, and it's in the front. And now you can pick up your empty needle in your right hand, and you're ready to start knitting again. So just continue to knit across the row like normal. Once you get to the end, you'll turn again and knit back. And you want to continue doing this until you have 12 rows. So the next instruction in the pattern says to cast on one stitch at the beginning of the next 6 rows. But I am going to suggest that you use a different stitch other than the cast on to give you a cleaner edge. And that's the one I'm going to show you. So instead of casting on, I'm going to knit one stitch, and then I'm going to use a stitch called the knit front back, which is essentially going to double this stitch. So I'm going to start off by knitting it just like normal until I get to here. Normally now I would slide this stitch off my needle, but instead I'm going to pull up on my right needle, and I want to go back into it in a different direction. So I'm just going over top of that loop, and I want to go into the back of this stitch so that I'm actually behind that needle. So I've just come from here, which is my normal knitting position, but I'm putting my needle in and back through that loop. This might take you a couple of tries to get right. Don't be discouraged. It looks a little bit different than you're used to, but it's going to give you a much cleaner finish than a cast on stitch at the edge will. And now I'm going to knit it just like normal. I'm going to take my yarn, wrap behind and over the tip of the needle, and then pull up on my left needle, and if you need to, hold on to that yarn. This stitch can be a little bit tight, and it's easy to lose the yarn. And then you can just slide your needle out. And now what you should see is a normal knit stitch, and then this knit stitch that looks like a bar, almost like it's on the wrong side of your knitting. And if you want to count, you should now have 39 stitches on your needle. So now you're going to continue knitting across the row, but you'll repeat that at the start of the second row. Now that you've knit 6 increased rows and you have 44 stitches on your needle, you're ready for the next step, in which we're going to bind off stitches at the beginning of the row to shape the wings. Now this works just like a normal cast off if you have knit one before, but it also incorporates the knit stitch. So what we're going to do is knit 2 stitches just like normal, and try and keep your knitting fairly loose because it will make the next step easier. So now what we want to do is pull this bottom stitch over the top one. And what that's going to do is just catch this stitch on this loop of yarn, make sure it doesn't go anywhere. So you're just going to put your left needle into the center of that stitch from front to back, and then pull up on it slightly, and you want to kind of hold down on your yarn to make sure it's not going anywhere as you just bring the tip of your right needle out, and then you can slide your left needle out of that stitch, and that's one bound off. And now we're going to repeat, so knit a stitch, and then you're going to take your left needle and pull the bottom one up and over the top. You'll probably have to hold onto your yarn fairly tightly, just make sure that you loosen it up again once you have bound off the stitch. So you'll see this line of V's along the side. If you've crocheted before, this might look like a chain. So what you want to do is continue doing this until you have 12 V's along the side. If you're not quite sure how to count them, that's okay. Just count the rest of the stitches on your needle. Make sure to include this one to make sure that you have 32 total. So once you've bound off 12 stitches or you have 32 stitches on your needle, just knit across the rest of the row. So I bound off the stitches I needed to here and then just knit back across the rest of the row, and I'm ready to start my second one. And for this one, we're just going to repeat the last row exactly the same. You're going to be binding off 12 stitches at the beginning and then knit across the rest of the row. So once I've knit 2, pull this one over top. So at the end of this row, at the end of this bind off, you should have 20 stitches total left on your needle, and then you want to knit back across, and you'll continue knitting rows for 12 rows. So remember to count your ridges to make sure how many rows you have, but once you've knit 12 rows with your 20 stitches, you are ready for the final bind off. Once you've finished knitting the rest of your rows, you're ready to do the final bind off. This is exactly the same stitch that we used on the wings earlier. You're just going to start by knitting 2 and then pulling this bottom stitch over the top one. And you want to do this all the way across the row. So I've bound off all my stitches but one. I can't bind off anymore because there's no stitches left on this needle for me to knit from and then pull over the top. So I've just gone ahead and cut my yarn. You want to leave yourself a fairly long tail so that you can use it to sew the chick. So I've got maybe a foot here. And once you've cut your yarn, just tug up on your needle to pull that yarn all the way through your stitch so that the yarn is leading directly out of that top stitch. Give it a tug, and that's it. You've bound off your knitting. Now the only thing left to do is sew it and stuff it, and you will have a finished basket.